And now I will give a floor to Holly Falk from the Western Washington University in Bellingham in Washington. And she will continue the subject that Mastem already started, is that on the sexual abuse, and she will talk about the Dutch and Belgian reports. So Holly, the floor is yours.
Well, hello, my name is Holly Folk. I'm from Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington, USA. I'm here to do a presentation on the Jehovah's Witnesses, on sexual abuse, and 3 reports that have come out in the past 5 years from Australia, the Netherlands, and Belgium. This is a work in progress, but I'll tell you what I've discovered so far, but everybody should know that some of this research is very much ongoing. I'd like to preface this presentation with an acknowledgement of the seriousness of the issues that I'm taking up. I understand from a personal perspective the seriousness of sexual violence and crimes in the family. I have an enormous amount of sympathy for the victims. I hope that they receive justice from society. I hope that perpetrators everywhere are brought to justice. But I also think that it's important to think clearly about these issues, to direct our energies efficiently so people can be brought to justice. And I don't think that we can afford to misdirect our attention and to use groups as scapegoats, especially if that means that people who are committing crimes amid us are allowed to go unpunished. So that is my take on this. I understand that my comments will probably be perceived as insensitive or as triggering for some of the people who view this presentation. I apologize. I really do feel for you in your experience, and I really do wish you well. That said, let me go back and point out a prominent article that came out a couple of years ago. I think this was actually last year, from the Atlantic Monthly, reporting on what they call the secret database of child abuse. This is an article that came out in a prestigious publication, but in the past few years there have been many, many reports that have come out that have said something similar, very often in tabloid publications, a secret database about child molestation. Back a couple of years ago as well, the BBC and other major news outlets took up this story. And so there's been a meme that's circulated in the media for a number of years now that the Jehovah's Witness organization is maintaining a secret database that protects pedophiles. I feel this is very unfortunate. I feel that there's an awful lot that is very deliberately misleading, and I'd like to be able to address some of that in my presentation today. So in order to do that, I'm going to start with a discussion of a report that came out from Australia in 2015. This made quite a big impression on global news when it came out. CNN picked up the story immediately in 2016 when the study was released, reporting that 1,000 or more Jehovah's Witnesses in Australia had been named as child abusers. So let's talk about this piece, which was called the Case Study Report 29 from the Royal Commission on Child Abuse, done in Australia in the 2010s. The assertion is that there were 1,006 perpetrators who had committed sexual crimes who were being hidden by the Jehovah's Witness organization. This is something that was reported in the media, and I'd like to talk about the study and the context for the study and some of its findings and how that bears on the additional coverage of this issue for the Jehovah's Witness organization. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, Case Study 29 on the Jehovah's Witness organization, is one of many studies that came out from Australia. This is different from the situation in the Netherlands or Belgium, in that the Australian study was done as part of a much larger commission looking at sexual abuse of children in institutions across Australian society. So in that sense alone, we have to acknowledge that there's at least a commitment or an intent for fairness and sort of comprehensiveness for how this issue has been played out. The Royal Commission, as I said, looked at many secular institutions, not just the JWs, but in terms of looking at complainants from the Jehovah's Witnesses, they only interviewed 2 people from cases from 1989 and 1992, respectively. And there was an issue that happened in the study done by the Royal Commission that is highly problematic and was carried over into the studies done in Europe as well. And that is that the Commission elected to conflate family-child sexual abuse with institutional abuse. And that is how they arrived at this number. So let's talk about the issue first about family-child sexual abuse versus institutional abuse and consider what's at stake. Something that we know, unfortunately, from a number of sociological studies is the rate of sexual abuse of children is very high. Large numbers of children in societies around the world report having been sexually abused. And we don't know quite so much about the rates of perpetrators, but the studies I've looked at all seem to sort of arrive at the idea that somewhere between 2 or 3% of men do victimize children in multiple countries. This is something that was found among other places in a study done in Australia. And so unfortunately, we need to anticipate that in any large human population right now, we are going to see sexual abuse of children, and that may happen, unfortunately, quite separately from how any individual religion or other social institution is operating. That is to say, it's not the beliefs of the organization that are actually driving the behavior. There's actually very little evidence that the Jehovah's Witnesses are guilty of what is typically considered institutional abuse, which we see in many other religious organizations. For one thing, the Jehovah's Witnesses do not have a set clergy in the same way that the Catholic Church has a bureaucracy of lifelong people whose entire vocation is religious work. They do not have children's programming. They basically operate as a lay organization. And as such, you do not see the same type of instances of children who are participating in Sunday school being abused by Sunday school teachers or pastors victimizing, adolescents or something like that, because the social organization of the JWs doesn't foster that. But when the Royal Commission were reviewing the files and the information from the Jehovah's Witnesses, they elected to convert over to institutional abuse any cases of sexual abuse that had happened within the family that were reported to Jehovah's Witnesses, especially in terms of how discipline of members of the organization was being conducted. And so the rationale from the Royal Commission was that in the reporting and the discipline, and then quite honestly, another way to look at this is in terms of the pastoral counseling and the pastoral care, the disclosure of information immediately made the religious organization liable. Now, in the present day, when there is mandatory reporting, there is liability, but in the cases that are coming forward around the world right now, you're talking about situations where mandatory reporting laws were not in place. And so we have to think, I think, very clearly about the rapidity with which standards have evolved. I think that that's a very, very good thing. But we also actually have to sort of take into context, when things happened and the standards of the time when they did. So moving forward and returning to the questions of the findings in the Australian study, the assertion in the media was that the Royal Commission found 1,000 or more perpetrators of sexual abuse in the Jehovah's Witness organization. And let's clarify the 1,006 statistic. It reflects the sum of all disciplinary reports and referrals, proven and unproven, that had been submitted to the Jehovah's Witness organization in Australia over a 65-year period. Half of those cases dealt with cases of incest within the family, and additional cases within that statistic concerned more extensive family members or family friends. And so in other words, the vast majority of these 1,006 disciplinary reports concerned family sexual abuse, and not abuse done by anybody who could be considered clergy or a religious worker for the Jehovah's Witness organization. The accusation that this was a cover-up is also not true. Of the 106 case files that the Jehovah's Witnesses provided to the Royal Commission, 383 of these had been reported to the police at the time that they had happened, and 161 of those cases had resulted in convictions for child sexual abuse. And so in other words, the notion that the Jehovah's Witnesses had hidden information or had not complied with law enforcement, or that these cases had not been brought to justice when they were reviewed, is not true. Okay, so moving back to this, 902 of the case files did not concern a Jehovah's Witness official. They were not at kingdom halls or other official premises, and they were not in a context where Jehovah's Witnesses were officially responsible for children. Now, the Jehovah's Witness organization in Australia maintains right now that they receive 2 to 3 calls a month concerning family sexual abuse, which, considering the size of the Jehovah's Witness organization in Australia, it's about 65 or 70,000 people, is unfortunately within the parameters of the rate of incidence for modern society. But over 65 years, they've had very, very few cases of institutional perpetrators. Now, the Royal Commission referred 551 quote-unquote JW cases to law enforcement, and it is possible that some of these are ongoing, and I don't know, but something that we do know is that over the past 5 years, what we have not seen in Australia is a massive wave of arrests and prosecutions of Jehovah's Witnesses on that continent. Moving backward to this, Australia's Royal Commission made many recommendations to religions in Australia overall, and they recommended to the government that a mandatory reporting law be imposed across the board. The Jehovah's Witnesses support that recommendation, and for the record, so do I. I strongly believe in mandatory reporting. But the Royal Commission also made 3 recommendations that drill down into the religious exercise of the JWs. They recommended that the Jehovah's Witness organization should abandon its application of the 2-witness rule in cases involving complaints of child sexual abuse. The witness organization should revise its policies so that women are involved in processes related to investigating and determining allegations of child sexual abuse. And the Jehovah's Witness organization should no longer require its members to shun those who disassociate from the organization in cases where the reason for dissociation is related to a person being a victim of child sexual abuse. Now, I'll return to these 3 recommendations once I talk about the Belgian and the Dutch reports. But let me point out a couple of things just in case I forget to note them later on. And that is that there's substantial flexibility for what is called the 2-witness rule regarding complaints of child sexual abuse, especially concerning cases of vulnerable minors where the person is still a minor. The Jehovah's Witnesses have a policy of intervening very strongly when a child is at immediate risk of harm. And from my conversations and my research so far about the application of the 2-witness rule, I think that the description in the media is highly overdrawn. This does not mean you need 2 people to catch somebody in flagrante delicto. it's much more a case of a reasonable amount of evidence coming forward from two different parties or two different perspectives. And that is something actually that's been ensconced in a number of religions around the world for a very long time. In terms of the gender question, let's just sort of note that the Jehovah's Witness organization operates under the perspective of gender complementarity. So do a great number of other religious organizations and religions around the world, including the Catholic Church and the vast majority of variants of Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. And thirdly, in terms of talking about the issue of shunning, and here too I want to acknowledge the pain that this issue brings to people who have left the religion. I understand very personally the effect that this can have over the course of generations when a family is broken apart by religious disagreement. But I also think that it is not the place of the government to intervene in the choices that consenting adults make. And the reality is that many religions do have the standard of no longer maintaining strong ties with people who have left their faith tradition. This is unfortunate, or maybe it's just simply a reality. People sometimes feel very mixed about it. But it's also within the rights of a religious organization to choose in terms of its operations. It's also important to note that in terms of all of these recommendations, we're talking about intervening not with the idea of creating a more effective prosecution process. The Jehovah's Witness disciplinary process is meant to discipline members. It's not meant to be a substitute for law enforcement. And one thing I've seen very clearly all the way through my research on this issue is that the Jehovah's Witness organization supports the bringing forward of criminal complaints to law enforcement by people. They do not think that members should be censored for bringing any type of criminal complaint forward before the law. But they believe that that's the choice of an individual. It's not the choice of the religion to be in that stance, and I actually understand that. So to move to talk about the reports from Belgium and the Netherlands, this is a little bit convoluted, and it's hard because some of the stuff is behind paywalls, so it's hard to read some of the articles that were important for this. But a couple of years ago, a number of articles ran in a Dutch newspaper, I'm going to butcher my Dutch, called Trouw, which means truth. It turns out to be a newspaper that is run with the backing of the Reformed Church in the Netherlands. And so we need to realize that this is a newspaper that has a national distribution, but it's also a newspaper with an active faith commitment behind it. And so they ran a series of articles accusing the Jehovah's Witness organization of covering cases or hiding cases of sexual abuse. With this, they worked very closely with at least one organization of activists, of former Jehovah's Witness members, who provided allegedly or reported that there were about 285 or 286 complaints from former members that had been collected from by this organization. As a consequence of this, there were, with the involvement of these articles, with these articles standing behind it, the two different studies were launched in Europe over the past couple of years. And there's a little bit of circularity to this. One was the Center for Information, CIAOSN, Sausen, which is a Belgian organization. It's an anti-cult organization. And they cited the newspaper articles that had run in the Netherlands as the rationale for running a study of the activities of the Jehovah's Witness organization in Belgium. So the main basis of the Belgian study was the Netherlands journalism. Now, I would like to talk about the findings of the Belgian study, but I have to say that there was very, very little information that was found or that was discovered in their inquiry. They reported newspaper accounts. They reported sort of very derogatory information about the Jehovah's Witness organization overall. And they reported that the Netherlands inquiry had uncovered 3 different complaints that had possible ties to Belgium, and they said on the basis of that an inquiry should go forward and the recommendations from the Australian studies should be adopted. But I honestly, I mean, I reviewed this, but I didn't see enough findings to really sort of say, here are the findings, because they didn't come forward with math or reports of complaints that could really be dissected. It was very much a disappointment. But here is the other thing. The Belgian study was commissioned and released first. It came before the government in Belgium after the piece came before the government in the Netherlands. So there's sort of an overlap in terms of their construction and their being brought forward. It's important to note that the Sausen study was done in cooperation with the Belgian Parliament. And similarly, there's government backing behind the study that was done in the Netherlands. Now, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the Dutch title of this study. I'll just sort of refer to it by English. And the Dutch study was called Sexual Abuse and Willingness to Report Within the Community of Jehovah's Witnesses. I reviewed this piece, the work here, and so there are a number of different things I want to say about it, and then we can talk about the studies overall and their collective sort of problems and findings. In the Dutch study, they reported having 751 complaints. And this number also was very, very quickly converted into the media with the idea that there were more than 700 Jehovah's Witnesses perpetrators who were sort of running at large in society. So here's what we need to sort of know about the Dutch study. It was commissioned in cooperation with the Center for the Ministry of Justice and Public Safety. It was commissioned with the help of certain government agencies that in the Netherlands have been accused of having very sort of politicized scholarship. And they ran a survey that had sort of 2 components. It had a telephone line one could call, and it had an email address box that you could send sort of your responses to. But they didn't vet the survey responses for unusable answers. And so hang-ups, duplicate answers, answers that looked like they had been deliberately written by people who were simply trolls who wanted to write something detractory about the Jehovah's Witness organization. All of those were counted as valid complaints. And so in other words, if you were writing in to answer and your internet connection broke and you had to resubmit the study, you are now considered 2 different complaints. And this is regardless of whether or not your complaint was even perceived as credible. And so if you were somebody who was trying to send an uncredible complaint, then that was not really sort of factored in, and it was very, very easy to corrupt this data. The other thing about this is that along with, in a way that's very similar to the Dutch study or to the Belgian study and the Australian study, all 3 studies worked with the notion that family abuse could and should be converted over to institutional abuse. Okay, the other thing about the Dutch study that's significant is that the Dutch researchers interviewed 10 people in conjunction with their survey. Now, remember the Australian study only interviewed 2 survivors, but 10 survivors were interviewed in the Dutch study. And here's what we have. 4 of those interviewees were not raised as Jehovah's Witnesses, and they were very likely reporting incidents in the past about situations where the Jehovah's Witnesses had absolutely no auspices whatsoever. And 7 of the cases of those 10 were more than 5 years old at the time of the study. And so in other words, if there was something where a police report were appropriate, the question one might ask is why hadn't it been filed outside of the time before this was actually disclosed to the JW organization? So, okay. The release of the studies in Belgium and the Netherlands have fed a fire that is quickly spreading around the world. One also needs to note that this issue is continuing in the United States and is very, very much an active issue there. But you can sort of see there's a very large media campaign and ongoing accusations of there being a Jehovah's Witness cover-up. So let's talk a little bit more about the reports in comparison and maybe drill down a little bit farther in terms of how these are sort of working. There are some problems in the aggregate. With all of these studies, we see encouragement and collusion with anti-cult associations, where the information is being conveyed to the government, where the studies are being proposed at the suggestion of anti-JW activists. I mentioned the issues of the Dutch study, especially in terms of their intake procedures for complaints. But in none of these studies has there been any questions about credibility of information. The similarities across the reports themselves are really sort of very surprising. I'm somebody who teaches college writing, and there's so much textual similarity from one study to the other. It looks very much like a cut and paste situation. My first response when I was reading the Belgian and the Dutch reports, sort of, almost sort of synoptically, is, if two students had handed me these two documents saying they had written them, I would have said, oh my gosh, who is vulnerable for an academic honesty issue? Because there is very, very much, it's just sort of simply kind of lifting of information, which suggests at the very best, sort of communication or cross-fertilization, or one could also maybe say collusion. There's a deliberate negative framing in all of these pieces, and so all of these reports make a very similar argument. And it's important to realize that all of these reports devote much more of their textual attention to a description of the Jehovah's Witness organization that's very detractory, and that information actually is a larger piece of the content in these reports than the actual addressing of complaints themselves. There's a persistent accusation that the Jehovah's Witnesses are a quote-unquote closed society. And I feel that this is inaccurate in two ways. It's inaccurate about quote-unquote closed groups, and it's inaccurate about the Jehovah's Witnesses as closed. Closed groups is a typology. It's a sort of a generic descriptor. It's a sociological paradigm, which many sociologists think is overdrawn. And it's never meant to substitute or be something that could sort of predict or explain how a religious group is going to sort of conduct itself. You pretty much invariably see at the personal level permeability, even groups that have strong social boundaries. And then I would also propose that it's inaccurate to think of the Jehovah's Witnesses as a group that has across the board strong social boundaries. There are clearly families and individuals who are much more tightly within the social network of the Jehovah's Witness organization. But I've had many friends who are JWs. I've gone out for hamburgers with people. I've drunk beer with people. I think you cannot assume that the JWs don't have regular dealings with the outside world. These are people who have businesses, who are active in society, and to sort of think about them as a group of people who are, living in some type of bunker where they're not able to communicate with the world. I just don't think that that's actually an accurate framing. The other thing I think that needs to be said is the causality between religion and sexual abuse is not clear. These reports assume that strong beliefs code with higher abuse, but this is based on stereotypes, and it overlooks the fact that abuse is endemic in modern society. It overlooks the fact that religions have the potential to prevent abuse through pastoral interventions. If you see something that's weird, you might warn a family, maybe you don't want to date that guy, that kind of situation. It's also known that conservative religions very often separate genders, keeping girls away from boys or away from men, and keeping children away from casual acquaintances. And so in those senses, the strong social boundaries and sort of social roles of a religious organization like the Jehovah's Witnesses might actually drive down the possibility of sexual abuse. And then it's important also to realize, again, that most religious abuse happens through opportunities. The Jehovah's Witnesses do not have children's programming, and so they have fewer occasions for abuse within a religious setting. This is one of the organizations that has been most powerful behind anti-Jehovah's Witness activism in Europe, the Reclaimed Voices Foundation. To continue talking about aggregate problems, you might want to sort of ask, why was so much detractory information that's not germane to the question of abuse incorporated into these studies? There's a portrayal of Jehovah's Witnesses as being deviant for having conservative religious beliefs, yet many other religions have similar views, including on the issues of gender and disfellowshipping. My grandparents were both disowned when they got married in the 1930s for marrying out of their faith traditions, and so I understand that personally. Family abuse versus institutional abuse deserves at least a little bit more discussion. Because the statistics have been shaped in each of these studies to make it look like the Jehovah's Witnesses are hiding active cases perpetrated by religious officials. And that's simply not true. In all three reports, the large number of cases reported are familial, yet this is downplayed, and in the media sometimes this is almost completely hidden. So I think that that's actually very unfortunate. Now this is the place where, again, I'd like to sort of preface my comments to say I understand on a personal level what it feels like to not get the justice you want. And at the same time, I think it's important to be realistic about which forces in our social system have responsibility and which ones where things become a lot more gray. So I would say that the age of the incidents, as in the year that things happened, the age of the victim at the time that they reported something, and their desires going forward, a variety of circumstances need to be taken into account, along with the fact that incest is the dominant category in all three reports. And let me say this, because I think that this is also important. I have not read the disciplinary reports from the Jehovah's Witness organization, but I have read all three of the studies, and I've read a variety of pieces, carrying forward the complaint of victims in the media. And something that becomes very, very obvious is that a number of these young people spoke to their parents, and their parents were the ones who chose to suppress this information. And they have every right to be angry. But one of the things that's being completely overlooked is something that we have documented, is the role that families had in keeping this information secret. So I think that's actually something that's actually very significant when we think about how to efficiently and effectively address this issue. To get a true estimate of whether any religion is associated with sexual abuse, it's important to factor in family abuse for all groups and not to think, okay, this is going to be an isolated phenomenon within particular religious traditions, and it's something that's not going to happen in other religions or in other parts of society. None of the studies have shown the Jehovah's Witnesses to have a pattern of shielding clerical abuse. This stands in contrast to other religions where abuse has become known. And the studies communicate many complaints about the process of investigation. I hear that. I understand that. But it's also important to realize that the Jehovah's Witnesses can offer a number of reports from individuals who appreciated the support they received during a family abuse crisis. Let me just say, I understand that these issues are very, very hard for pastoral care, and it would probably be good if people who were involved in counseling across the board managed to up their game. But I also think that we cannot retroactively apply standards that did not happen or were not in place 30 years ago, 40 years ago, for cases where in some cases, in many cases, unfortunately, the perpetrator has already died. So that's actually kind of a problem. So, the three reports made very similar recommendations. They called to end the two-witness rule for cases of sexual abuse. They called for inclusion of women in investigation and discipline of cases of sexual abuse, and they called for changing the policy of disfellowshipping victims who choose to leave the Jehovah's Witnesses. If somebody has had a break with one's faith tradition, one can understand why one would want some of these changes to be made. But at the end of the day, these recommendations are an intrusion of government into religious exercise. They unfairly single out the Jehovah's Witnesses, ignoring how other religions have similar beliefs and practices. The Jehovah's Witnesses do comply with mandatory reporting laws wherever they are instituted. They support the institution of mandatory reporting laws everywhere. The standards for addressing sexual abuse have evolved, fortunately, but in terms of Jehovah's Witnesses, these standards are now being applied selectively and retroactively. So that is something that I think is very significant. I will leave you with something else to sort of think about in terms of who is gaining from this international media gain. Obviously anti-cult activists, well, actually I was going to say, anti-JW activists, and also sort of more mainstream anti-cult activists are very involved in this effort. So we can sort of see here, I thought that this was really sort of an amazing kind of like, oh my gosh, Watchtower kind of file. But the other thing along with kind of anti-cult activism, which the JWs have faced for a very long time, is to think concretely about who is benefiting from this campaign. And that is to say, there's a huge financial interest in driving the demonization of the Jehovah's Witness organization. There are personal injury lawyers who have shown up across the United States and increasingly around the world. There are open calls. Please, contact our law firm and we'll see what we can do. And so nobody should be surprised to sort of know that this has actually become a very profitable business, and think about that as a motive for why it's being pushed forward as an issue right now. Let me conclude by noting that the Jehovah's Witnesses have a public statement. Jehovah's Witnesses abhor child abuse as a sin and crime. Our policies on child protection comply with the law, including any requirements for elders to report allegations of child abuse to authorities. The organization will continue to promote child protection education for parents. So I will end here. I'm sorry I went over. I thank everybody for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully sometime in person in addition to cyberspace. Thank you.